We are going into today. I don't even really remember what we talked about in the last session. We started with spirituality. What is the meeting point between the psychological aspects and the spiritual aspects, the East and the West, as it were, and how does it apply to coaching and so on. I don't really want to revisit that, but if there are any questions that come up during this particular session, we can certainly talk about it. What I would really like to have is a very, very interactive discussion. Please interrupt, raise your hands. I'll move you on to the panel. When I put down my thoughts on this, I sent out a mail yesterday, but after that, when I was thinking about it, there is a certain element of the use of self in coaching itself, and I'll come to that in a minute, which is probably the most important as far as this session is concerned. And how does it link with the use of self as a concept in spirituality, which to me, the congruence of these two is perhaps what is today called transpersonal coaching, which was first articulated by John Whitmore several decades ago. And Fiona is not here in this call today, but she is one of the greatest examples of practitioner in transpersonal coaching. Whatever little I understand of how she does transpersonal coaching, I'll try and explain. But far more importantly, this is something we have taken up seriously, and so we'll be presenting Fiona from early next year in a series of webinars on transpersonal coaching, which would be like a certification program. The other two elements of it, which sort of juxtapose in between and very related to coaching in many ways, would be the way that OD, organizational development principles, pioneered by NTL to start with, how do they view the use of self? Because that's a very, very integral part of it. It started to some extent with Gestalt and OD. And the other is other aspects of psychology, like, for example, Freudian, Jungian, and so on. How do they view that? So there are these four, to my mind, some of them coming together, overlapping, and some of them somewhat distinct, which I see, which sort of I would think about when I talk about the use of self. And we will talk about how it is actually, in what way is that use of self relevant to coaching. I don't remember exactly. It's only when I saw Liz and Sandy, I remember that she spoke about the use of self. I wish really I had gone through her video once again to refresh my memory on that. The simplest way that I would put that in coaching, and any of you have a different opinion, please interrupt me and then come over on this, is I think the closest attribute that in ICF competencies that comes to the use of self is probably the competency of presence. In a sense, presence is about partnering, the way the ICF competencies are defined. And it is not necessarily what we normally mean by presence, which is something very qualitative that you know when you see it. It's not something that you can explain in great terms, but if you really go by the way the competency markers are, it's mostly about partnering. But a large part of that partnering is about how the coach notices what the client says, maybe what the client feels by asking questions, and what the client is to some extent, and then converts that into a kind of an expression of inquiry, curiously, with the client as to what is happening out there. But very often, and I have been guilty of that as well, in early days when I was training people, and today my whole approach has changed a little bit. We always assume that the interaction between the coach and the client is not about the coach. And therefore, there is a reluctance for the coach to say anything about what the coach might feel, he or she, at that point in time, in response to what the client has said. And I'm struggling to find words a little bit here because that's a way I had been interpreting the competencies for a long time, but not anymore. If I do notice that the client is feeling frustrated, I might, in some ways, try and force it back into the client, say, hey, this is what I'm noticing, this is what I'm observing in terms of the words that you use or in the body language and so on. But I would not normally, as a coach, stop and look at myself and express what I feel in me as I watch the client go through the struggle, helplessness, frustration, anger, anxiety, whatever it may be. And if I did, I would have earlier thought that this was in some ways against the coaching ethics, the coaching competencies, because I'm bringing a bit of my ego, a bit of my judgment into this. And as I went through my own mastery journey, and as we worked with several people towards a mastery, and John is here as one example of a person who won this program, and he's an MCC now. Cindy and I, we discovered that without the ability of the coach being able to express himself or herself appropriately to the client in terms of what they are feeling, it's only half the job done. There's a large part of the job that is not done. And this is brought out extremely sharply, or was brought out extremely sharply for me when I went through a supervision program. And in supervision program, those of you who are familiar with the supervision model, and several of you in this particular program may have been attendees at webinars that we conduct on supervision as well. There are seven eyes, and the sixth eye, Peter Hawkins' model of 7-eye model, is about the reflections of the coach. Now, even when I went through the supervision, for a long time, my interpretation of this based on my lens of coaching competencies was about actually what I noticed as what the client was doing, and that I considered as my reflections. Till one of my supervisors, or two of my supervisors, both Damien, who was a program, he was a provider of the program, and Eva Pontes, who was my supervisor, they both pointed out to me that I'm not fulfilling the requirements of the sixth eye. Everywhere else you're doing well, but how come that you're not able to fulfill the requirements of the sixth eye, which is about the reflections of the coach? I said, of course I am. I'm watching what the client is saying, and I'm reproducing that. I'm noticing, observing the way that CC4 in coaching competencies, which is presence, you're required to do. And then with their help, I understood that was something very, very different. That in the sixth eye, as it were, the need for me is to be able to look into myself, perhaps somatically, what's really happening within me. And at that point in time, when I started doing that, there was a complete difference in terms of my relationship with the client. There was a far better connect. It was, till then it was good communication, but the communication became much more of a communion in terms of my emotional ability to connect with the client, my somatic ability to connect with the client. Whether that is true, whether it is part of my imagination or whatever, that doesn't matter. But the very fact that I'm able to look at that while I am going through the coaching process and be able to explain to the client, hey, this is what I feel. tell me, how does that make you feel? And we really went to a much higher level of empathy, trust, presence, communication, all that awareness with this kind of an approach. While ICF does not clearly state this, and Liz would know, she has been heading that organization for a long time, had headed in EMCC. The very first competency is understanding self. And that understanding self is all about this aspect. Are we at the time when we are engaging with the client, are we also, not necessarily later by looking at a transcript or a recording or whatever it is, but at that point in time, as we are in the process of coaching, taking some time to reflect, not only provide the silence, which is to provide the space for the client to expand. Of course, that's very, very necessary. But also use that silence to be able to sense within ourselves what's really happening. And is that going to make a difference to the client? Everything that I had earlier sort of thought I had understood said, no, you're not supposed to say it because that is an expression of your ego. That's the expression of your judgment. But honestly, when I started doing it, I found that there was a way that I could keep my judgment and ego and my beliefs of right and wrong away from it. And I just could tell the client, hey, this is really what I'm feeling. And is there anything that brings to you, that brings up for you, that helps you to shift? And this was a phenomenally powerful experience for me. And that is really what I wanted to share today. And we'll go into the spiritual side of it in a few minutes after I throw this open to you for discussion. Because I think this has tremendous implications. And this, I think, is really the essence of reaching mastery in coaching. It's not only about, very often we say we should question the who of the client, but at the same time, my belief is now that you should also question the who of the coach, or the coach should question the who of the coach. What is happening? In a sense, who am I at that point in time? And do I have the vulnerability to be able to bring that up to the client and saying, hey, this is a feeling that I have. I feel conflicted, or I feel emotionally overwhelmed, or whatever. Do I have the courage? Do I have the vulnerability to be able to say that? And for those of you who might have watched, and I'm coming back to this because she was the one who really made me understand this much more powerfully, and she's a bit of a role model for me, is when you are engaged with Fiona, which I did both as a client in coaching as well as in supervision, her ability to go into the depths of this and very, very simply put it across to me, Ram, this is what I'm feeling at this point in time as I listen to you, as I watch you sit in front of me, as you talk to me. So what do you think about it? And then the conversation took a completely different direction, a completely different shape, a different awareness. So I'll stop here for a minute. So someone has asked a question, I'll answer that first. John, yeah, I don't know, if you don't mind, you can stay there. You said that you would like to be removed, but how would you motivate or coach who's depressed personally and professionally? I don't know. I mean, see, these kind of hypothetical questions have no answers. But if I am sitting in front of a client who's perhaps depressed, and depression usually is arising out of some feeling of helplessness. And if that helplessness is coming out in the way the client is talking about, like, for example, this morning I was with a young person with whom this conversation led to some of that. All that I really did was to go with what Carl Rogers calls unconditional positive regard. And I would suggest that you also employ, which I think is a little more advanced way of treating this, is please do read Otto Scharmer, Theory U, and where he talks about what is called generative listening, the fourth level of listening. And I had talked about it in some of the sessions before. Generative listening is the ability to be able to look at the client the way that the client wishes to be, and the way a coach should look as the potential of the client, which the client is trying to reach. So which is no longer a depressed client, but a client who's completely normal and who's fulfilled. And if you're able to put the client in that frame, whatever comes to your mind would be in line to take the client out of that state of depression. And I mean, just to quote this example of what earlier happened today, and that's really what happened. The awareness comes in from the client as well. So, so those of you, if any of you would like to come on to the panel and pose this question, or any of you in the panel, Liz, Jackie, and Ramcharan and John, if you have any questions, please feel free. Let's start with your questions, and if there's Raghuraman has raised his hand, MG, I'm promoting to the panel. Yeah, so far it's only MG. Yeah. Okay. Any questions?
Well, Ram, I have a response to the question that you posed.
Yeah.
So I was trained as a coach a long time ago, back in 1994, and right in my coach training, some of the key distinctions that we learned was this idea that we are emotional beings. Humans are emotional beings, intellectual beings, and physical beings. And so as a coach, we need to observe what's happening with ourselves and with our client on all these different levels, and that we could intervene on any of those levels. So that's what I learned as a coach. And that we also did some training in somatics. We actually did an exercise where we walked with a partner, and we walked around the room, and we were supposed to actually model everything about the way they were holding themselves, like the way they held their head on their neck, and the way they moved their arms, and the way they moved their hips. And we were supposed to model that and just walk around the room and doing that. And then the exercise was you were supposed to tell the person how you felt. This is how I feel walking like this. And so the person I modeled, my experience was, I didn't want to say anything insulting. So I just said, here's my experience. My experience of walking like this is that other people's needs are so much more powerful and important that my needs would get lost. And I said that to this woman, and she just, her jaw dropped. She just really, what I was saying was actually exactly how she was feeling. So I was trained early on when ICF was just forming about the same time. And so my understanding was that number one, we are always supposed to create a safe space for learning, that the coach's job, the most important job the coach does, is to create a safe space for learning. And so the meeting is all about supporting the client, the coachee. It's all about being present for them and what they're looking to achieve, and that these ways of being are all part of the tools. And so as long as I'm sharing my emotions in service to them, or I'm sharing what I'm picking up on my body or in my emotions or in my thoughts, as long as I'll sometimes think of something multiple times in a session, and then I'll just pay attention. It's come up multiple times. So I'll just trust that it's something like an intuition to share. So that's the way that I approach it, and to just be very cautious not to have something I'm bringing up being about me. It's about what I'm picking up in service to what they're wanting.
Sure.
Why they're with me in that moment, and what they're looking to achieve.
Okay. Liz, any comment?
Yeah, sure. I think it's a great topic, this, because it's very current, and it goes against a lot of the approaches to coaching competence that is out there in the frameworks. Just as you said, Ram, you know, there's something around the trainings where we're supposed to keep out of the client space. I can remember years ago training on clean language, where the whole approach to that was just to use a set of questions which were supposed to remove the bias that coaches may bring into the conversation. And, you know, if we think that through logically, how can we keep ourselves out of the conversation? I mean, the mere fact that we're sitting there with someone, and look at us today. I can see kind of 7 photos or people on screen. We're together as a community here. We can't keep ourselves out of this discussion one way or another. It may be what Jackie's saying, that we're noticing what's happening in people somatically, but there's sure to be something that's happening within us that we're sensing, picking up, an energy that we're creating together. So I think we have moved on, Ram, in terms of being able to question now what's of most service to the client. And I mean, it's not realistic to say we can keep ourselves out of the conversation, but also we are missing another resource in terms of, it's okay when we look at a competence framework to say we are noticing what's happening in the client. I think we're well versed in that now, and we will say that. But about what we're noticing in ourselves and how that can help the client. I mean, I can just give you an example from a supervision session that I did recently with a coach who had a massive ideas and creativity, and she couldn't get to the goal that she wanted to get to because all these thoughts were crowding her brain and she didn't know which one to select. And then she'd start again, and she was talking like this, and there was all these arms going, and there were more and more information coming out, and I went, oof, I'm overwhelmed. I've got a feeling of overwhelm. She said she was exhausted. I said, I'm starting to feel exhausted. And she could just see that in me. And I felt that was okay to share it. And actually, she had quite a breakthrough at the end of the conversation about how she can contain this creative spirit, not to lose it because it's a valuable resource to her, but how she can contain it. And I didn't feel I was bringing my ego in or my opinion. I was just saying how I felt as a human being, because I felt that connection with that person in that moment. And she took it in the spirit that it was meant. I'll just say that for now, Ram, okay?
No, that's exactly the point I was making. It's not about watching the client somatically, emotionally, cognitively, and being able to say, hey, this is what I'm noticing about you, but rather are looking into ourselves and being able to, at that point in time, like you said, look, I'm exhausted or I'm feeling helpless as I listen to you. So I just would like you to know, which very often it's very difficult for many people to do because it makes yourself extremely vulnerable. You become the learner in front of the client. So are you able to do it? So that is really where I believe, I mean, ICF does touch upon it in terms of saying in the competencies that the coach is a learner, but we don't go deep into it to look at it, the wisdom of those words. And for whatever reason, I mean, like Jackie was saying, that I think it's fantastic if you probably had, I'm sorry to say that, but better trainers than I had. But the point was that what was drilled into me at that point in time was that don't bring your judgment in. And I agree, you can't bring your judgment of right and wrong and ethics and morality and all that in. But at the same time, is there a way for us to express what we feel in a very appropriate manner, which is not in any way bringing the client down in terms of the positive regard? Yeah, so let me stop there. So others, I think MG, you had some question. Ram, you had something. You're already in the panel. So if you would like to ask your question.
Yeah, well, I mean, two things came up for me strongly in this discussion. One is that, you know, if you look at the difference between a coach and a friend who one might go talk with, there's a big difference, because typically I think people's way of interacting socially is that even if you're discussing a problem with a friend, everybody wants to speak more about themselves, than listen to the other person. So as we move into becoming coaches, we've got this strong conditioning. Coaches have to be told over and over, it's not about you. Keep yourself out of the picture, because there's such a strong tendency to go in the opposite direction. So it's like the training. We need to have this as coaches, otherwise we're not coaches. At some point, I think it has to be more about a balance, because, and here's how I kind of see a transpersonal aspect. If, for one thing, there's no such thing as objectivity, absolutely speaking. When there are humans involved, it is subjective. So if we keep ourselves, or try to keep some idea of ourselves out of the conversation, we're creating more division at some point. So to open up to the sense that everything that's happening is information. I'm listening to everything here, but not from my personal agenda. I'm listening in service of my client's needs. And as has been touched on, information that comes up in my experience, my somatic experience, my emotional experience, I think better to err on the side of caution and not overshare. But if things are coming up strongly, this is my experience, I think most people's experience, as you've discussed, a lot of times that can really shift a session, because then your coachee doesn't have the sense that they're dealing with somebody who's hiding behind a professional, quote unquote, objective role. So those are my thoughts, as I listen to this conversation.
Thanks. Before I go to the others, I'll just look at some of the questions that we have. Sylvie, it's a very, very good question. Are there feelings that are not okay to share? And I'm sure there are. The point is, at least the filter that I would use is it about the positive, unconditional positive regard to the client? Is it about the generative listening? Is it looking at whatever you share? Is it about where you wish the client to be, where the client wishes to be? And in some senses, it's also about one of those noble truths of the Buddha. A truth is not truth unless it's of relevance and it's of help to the other person who hears it. Otherwise, it's very much our own judgment. Just like Ramcharan said, there is nothing which is truly objective. Everything is subjective. So I guess the most important thing is, if we are looking at it from a spirit of what is it that we can do to help the client, and what is it that we say would help the client. And probably the word that comes to me is compassion. The person who comes to my mind is the Dalai Lama. And if we role model that kind of a person, that everything that we say is in that compassionate regard for the other person, taking that for the person upwards, I think that's probably the right thing to share. And otherwise, maybe it's better to keep quiet rather than sharing that, or reflect upon it later at some point in time. Understand why those feelings are coming up for us, and then we can go deeper into the way that Daniel Goleman talks about emotional intelligence, the 4 quadrants in terms of self-awareness, our ability to manage. That's another subject in a sense. Mahesh, yes, it is dancing with the client. But very often the dancing is not necessarily interpreted. If you are interpreting it that way, and if you're doing it that way, it's fantastic. But very often the dancing of the client is expressed in a way that are you sharing what you notice about a client, and therefore you feed it back to the client, and then the client, based on that, responds in a way, and that could be dancing as well. Here, the fundamental difference that perhaps there is if you're already doing it, and it's really fantastic. All I'm saying is that I come across almost every single person that Cindy and I have trained to mastery has a problem with that, in terms of truly noticing what the client is feeling and so on. At the same time, also truly noticing what the coach feels within herself or himself and be able to express it. So that's a reality. But if you are able to dance, that's fantastic. How can you appear authentic when you don't respond? Yes, you have to be authentic. You have to learn to be vulnerable. You have to feel that it is okay to express what you feel, and you have to feel as much as possible objective, or at least remove that element of subjectivity which is arising from your issues of wrong and right, as different from the client's, but looking at purely the situation and being completely be concerned about the client. So these are some of the things that, yeah, so now we'll go to the other questions a little later. Yeah, MG, you and Vishy had some questions or comments. Yeah, if you can be brief, then we can move on to the other questions asked, please. Thanks. Yeah, please, you're muted. You have to.
Okay. Thanks, Ram, for giving me a...
Just 1 second, MG. Is my voice clear? Because Jackie, you said my voice is a little muffled. Is it still muffled, or am I okay? Am I audible?
Yeah, he says it is fine now.
It's fine. Okay, thanks. Yeah, continue, MG, please.
Thanks, Ram, for this very nice session. Ram Saran said something which I was able to resonate with. Whether we share who we are in a coaching conversation as a coach to the coachee or not, but there is a response which is happening deep inside us as a reflection in the form of a rational reaction to what the coachee says, and also as a emotion that gets generated inside. The authentic bit is that we are responding as human beings. We are persons after all. We are not robots, right? No matter how much invisible we want to be as a coach, how we practice ourselves, etc., there is a human being in us. And I don't think we should be shy to be that person. After all, the coachee is also selecting a coach. In the corporate world, they are selecting out of 5-6 profiles. Why? What is he looking for in that particular coach whom he has selected? There is a person in that coach that coachee is looking for. There is a personality in the coach which the coachee is enjoying the conversation. There is the synergy creates a wow. So I think I have been battling with this absolute invisibility of a coach for quite some time. And thanks for bringing this topic. You're now making me feel a lot less guilty. And, it's okay as long as you do feel it, as long as you don't trespass and make a judgment. Of course, that's a difficult bit, but being authentic occasionally and then finding a nice balance between invisible coach and you expressing yourself as a coach occasionally to just convey compassion, build some more trust with the coachee. I think it's a brilliant thing. It's a nice thing. I'm happy that you brought this topic because at least I won't feel any more guilty about some of the things which I'm doing occasionally.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah. First of all, I mean, I wouldn't say that the invisibility part of it is a myth. It's in some ways it is true. The invisibility refers to our ego. And to the extent that we are in complete alignment with the client, congruent, the client needs, positive regard, you can still express your feeling and still be invisible. You're not coming in the way in that sense. So I guess each one of them, you have to learn to use the words appropriately in that sense. Vishy, any questions? And then I can go on to what some of them have said in the panel. Yeah, you are muted, Vishy. You're muted.
No, I just find myself in the list of participants, Ram. So I just raise hand and you put me in the panel. I don't have any question. You
don't have any questions. Okay. I thought your hand was raised. That's okay. So some of the other questions are, how can you appear authentic when you don't respond your usual way? As I said, I think I already answered it. you have to be authentic. Otherwise, the whole thing is meaningless. How does a coach decide to compress and decompress oneself in practice? Rachna, I'll come back to you later. I think I'll get you to explain that. I really don't understand the question. Compression and decompression are somewhat new concepts to me in the sense of coaching. Casey, +1 on authenticity question, follow-up. How can you be authentic when you're enrolled to some extent? What techniques or strategies to use? It's a very, very good question. As long as you think you are on a roll, I don't think you are really being a coach. Being a coach, I mean, if you are going to be that only when you sit in the chair and you think that you are performing that role, then you will perform very differently. You might perform in terms of a solution-oriented manner and so on and so forth. You are then an actor. For you to truly be authentic, I don't know whether you have read Carl Rogers, if you have read Otto Scharmer. I think these are people you really should get into what Otto Scharmer calls a source, completely let go into self-reflection. And in that space, would you be able to coach? I mean, we can talk about it more. Unfortunately, in this session, there may not be enough time. What techniques or strategies, essentially these kind of strategies that can I mean, John here, when he started out on his mastery, when I mentioned about this book, Carl Rogers on Becoming a Person, and he pretty much, he didn't write a thesis, but he could have, and he went into such depth of doing it, and he said how it changed the way that he looked at things and how he coached. So it makes a difference when some of these masters, some of these legends, if you go into the depths of what they are saying. But separately, if you need anything more, we can talk offline as well. Down to earth question, expressing the self, would that be acceptable? I think it does, Mohan. You can use it for an assessment, provided it is put appropriately. It does not come across as a leading kind of input from the coach and so on. So it's certainly possible. I mean, most of the people who we now train in mastery, we do that, and they perform quite well. How do you manage working with clients who habitually make a frustrated of a client? Kimberly, that's a very good question. I don't know. I'm the wrong person to ask this, because there isn't a client that I have come across till today who I don't like. And I'm not saying it just for being socially acceptable, polite, or whatever. But the point is, the whole mindset changes. That's a spiritual side of it. There's little time, I'll come to that. If you really put yourself in that space where genuinely there is a compassion, there is no way that what you don't, when you start not liking people or liking people, it's your ego. That's really what makes it happen. So can you transcend that? Perhaps meditation would help. The topic of reflexivity addressed wonderfully in the book Coaching Presence Building Concession is okay. Maybe, I don't know. Michael, I haven't read this book, but yeah, there's time you can explain that. Will it not be being your natural self as a person with a consciousness of your role as a coach? Because assuming any posture which is not, absolutely. That's what I mentioned about authenticity. You have to be natural. You have to be authentic. It's not, I would say it's more than translucent, it's transparent. To me, translucent still there's a barrier. You're not fully sort of being open. Can you really be in open communication? My parents are about 60 years, I'm just 22. They want me to get married and take care of my sister. Is this force bearable? Sorry, I'm not going to be an agony aunt in this particular session. Probably this question belongs elsewhere. Murugan, ego is a shadow of self, difficult to remove the shadow. That's not true. You can, as you said, bring the light to remove the shadow, do whatever you want to do. Don't stand against the light which casts the shadow, probably. Tools and techniques are what happens until the coach turns up. Sure, I completely agree with you, Liz. you forget about all the tools and techniques. It becomes natural. Yeah, it is recording. You are attending the session, but it's being recorded, so we'll be able to put it out on the webinar. Who was the person who asked me a question, which Rachna, let me get you to ask me this question about, yeah, what is it? Compression and decompression. Sounds extremely scientific, very technical, very automotive. So let me understand what the question is. Yeah. You are muted. You are muted. Now it's worse. You switched off the video. We want you to unmute yourself. Rachna, are you able to hear me? Okay, we'll wait for her in case she manages to speak. So going into this spirituality part of it and the remaining part of it, the simplest way that I can combine or move from the segue in from one to another is typically, most of you who might be familiar with some amount of OD kind of lore, there are these three circles which intersect. One circle is I, and the other is we, and the third is it. These are overlapping circles. The I overlaps with the we as well as it, and each one of the circles. The it is generally, it could be the environment, it could be the organization. As far as the OD is concerned, it's mainly the organization. And in some senses, the whole concept of systemic coaching arises out of that. The relationship between the I and the we and the it, and all three working together. I really don't have the time to go into it, but surely if there are questions, I'll answer that. And there are these postulates about what is called the internal interior, the internal exterior, and so on. The internal interior is about how you self-reflect and look at yourself, which is about, let's say, the intentions, the values and beliefs and stuff like that. The internal exterior is about the way that you behave with other people. And then there are larger external individual behavior patterns, and there are exterior collective patterns. So some of it is arising from Jungian concepts. So each one of them you can understand separately and move forward. But the way that my understanding of the Hindu-Buddhist law, and in some ways I think there is a commonality with the Christian beliefs and Judaic beliefs as well, is that we are all part of a much larger energy. We are, in a sense, a hologram, and we are a split of the larger hologram, which is the universal energy. And one of the oldest scriptures in the Hindu law called the Upanishads, the oldest Upanishad, it starts with a particular verse, which is the invocation verse. Many of you people here who are familiar with the Hindu beliefs, you would know that. Is about, it says, that is infinity, this is infinity. The word used is Purna, which could mean full, complete, infinite, whatever. That is infinity, that means the universe is infinite. This, you, I, is infinite. And this infinite being comes out of that infinite being. And even after this infinite being comes out of that infinite being, that being remains infinite. You can get confused by it, but if you really look at it, all that it is really saying is you are part of a much larger hologram. And when that hologram splits, you are still whole. You are not in any way impaired, nor are you impairing the larger whole. And in a sense, that is really, to me, the fundamental principle on use of self. Am I looking at myself as a part of a larger whole? Am I looking at myself as a part of a larger whole, of which everyone that I'm interacting, either individually or collectively, they are part of that too. Is that possible for me to be able to do that? I do agree it's difficult. I'm not saying it's going to be very easy because there's a lot of selfish interests which are coming. But at the same time, is it possible for us to not necessarily subjugate our selfish interests to something larger, but at the same time, can we bring them together in some way? And that is what really ultimately in institutional organization, collective, in any context, is going to be effective. As long as we are looking at only our maximization of that selfish interest, it's a kind of a zero-sum game. You're trying to detract from something. And that is what we always do. And even in a coaching conversation, sometimes that's really what happens. The coach wants to impress the client. And therefore, there is something that the coach has to be able to contribute to that session, either in terms of somehow leading the client into a solution and not really quite trusting the process. And this same thing, we overcome that. But generally, I have found even master coaches, when I'm working with them as a client, I found that shows up. On the other hand, if we completely trust that we are part of that larger self, and in some ineffable way, that there is this collective consciousness, collective unconsciousness that Jung talked about, the collective consciousness that the Hindu Buddhist philosophy talks about, the Brahman and the Akashic record and all that stuff. So does it make a difference? And after all, it was an Englishman who said, no man is an island. And no man is, no woman is, no person is. We are all connected. And that's what makes a difference. And if that simple belief that we can apply to every interaction that we have with another person, the empathy automatically comes up, the presence automatically comes up. And we don't have to necessarily force ourselves to dance, we dance. And that's really what happens. So I'll just stop there. I mean, we can get into this in a much larger framework in terms of what the spiritual aspects are. I think Ramcharan is probably bursting to comment on this and ask questions perhaps, because this is a central theme of in Christian belief. The other day, I just want to share this example. I was at a memorial of a friend, and the priest was talking about, in the Christian belief, that death is not an end. And he spoke so beautifully about it. I mean, he didn't use the same word, but at some point in time, he said, of course, he was an Indian, and he said, it's very similar. All religions come up to the same point. He said, the death is in some ways probably a beginning. And he quoted various verses from the Bible, which pretty much said, Paul and so on, Corinthians and all that, which essentially said that whether you are alive, whether you are dead, if your belief is that you are one part of the larger whole, then there is no difference. It's just that the material system is different. And when we are interacting with somebody else, is it possible for us to bring ourselves into that space where we are looking at another person as an extension of ourselves? And this is what the scripture that I referred to, on which the invocation I talked about, there is a verse in that. The word that they use is called Isa, I-S-A. The Isa is also common to Hebrew and Sanskrit. Isa is a word from which the word Yesu, which in turn became Jesus in English, came about. Even today in India, many languages refer to Jesus as Yesu, which is the equivalent of the Sanskrit Isa. Isa means energy. And it says very, very simply, the person who is able to look at another person and see himself or herself in that person, and the person who is able to see the others in himself or herself, He is that energy. It's contextually, cognitively, yeah, you can keep on arguing about it. Hey, is this what it means? It doesn't mean. But you can actually, once you start realizing it, and when you're able to some extent, you get a glimpse of what it is. Then when you talk to a client, you see yourself in that client, and you see the client in you. And then you are able to express that. There can be no question of non-authenticity. It is purely authentic. And there is no question of something that you cannot say. Everything that you say would be for the benefit of that person, and that is what you are. And you at that point in time believe that the client is you. I don't know if I'm making sense to you, but you can get yourself into that state. So I'll stop here at this point in time.
I think you are making complete sense, actually, Ram. And I think the concept that we find difficult to grasp is that we know it when it's there, that feeling. We know it when it's not there. But to be able to articulate it, and it was lovely to hear your views and bringing in the examples, to be able to articulate that closeness that one feels, and I mean closeness in terms of the recognition that you were meaning, is difficult. It's a challenge. And that's where I think people find it a difficulty for them to grasp the idea of that, to think that they can accept the concept, yeah, we're connected and there's an energy, but to take it further than that, to see ourselves in someone else or see them in ourselves. It's okay to say it, you need to accept it.
I agree. I'll just one small bit. The one technique training process which helped me was something called Vipassana, which is a 10-day Buddhist meditation practice. And that was when I discovered it. And for every single person I coach, I usually recommend that if you're really interested in discovering yourself, do the Vipassana. It could be a very good starting point. Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. I had a lot of response to that. Although, I mean, it's music to my ears to hear this sort of discussion in the coaching webinar. I think, what really resonates for me is this age-old, emphasis on inquiry into the nature of self. And that, in a sense, we're in a coaching conversation it is inquiry. It's satsang in that sense. Are these beliefs true? There is a saying in the Yoga Vasishtha that Maya appears to exist as long as it's not inquired into, but upon inquiry, it's found to be non-existent. I come back to that again and again and again, because our experience seems real, but in a deep meditative state of inquiry or a focused kind of dialogue and inquiry, there's a deconstruction that happens. And ultimately, even the sense of self is deconstructed. So presence even can merge into a sense of absence of self, and still there is consciousness. So from that place, these things start to make sense, that the other is myself. We are the same absence expressing itself as presence. But to the ego, to the mind, it makes zero sense. It is a completely experiential, understanding. So how to bridge that and formulate it somehow, or bring steps that can, help a coach or any person inculcate that level of awareness, that's really the question. And that, to me, is where coaching and sadhana become one thing. Coaching and spiritual practice become one thing. Does this make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just substitute Maya with the word limiting beliefs. Is exactly the same.
Exactly the same.
Not inquiring into it. So you can substitute the scriptures with Martin Seligman and his ABCDE model, where you start disputing the belief and you find the belief melts away. So I mean,
yes,
there's so much of congruence in these kind of things that as a coach, if we are really looking at multiple disciplines, you will always find some tremendous amount of learning that happens. MG, you had a question. Last question. We are pretty much on top of the.
Okay. Quick, Ram sir, again, I don't know how we should talk to each other. We seem to be connected very well. I read recently Homo Deus by Yuval, and one of the things he does talk about is constant questioning of the so-called beliefs, right from liberalism, humanism, God, etc., and how the first few questions tend to take you to a conclusion that some of them are delusions. But I'm not wanting to discuss that. I just wanted to support what Ram Charan was saying. But the point which was recently I read an article on conscious parenting. And there it was a small video, I forgot the name of the author, who talked about, he said the children are spiritual beings having a human experience, which tends to take, I internalized it and I realized that all of us are actually spiritual beings who are always connected with the overall, the oneness, but the human experience in us automatically keeps downside, limits us in the way we feel spiritual. The more human you are, even if you believe in that oneness which Lisa was having struggle with on a day-to-day basis, is one thing to consciously accept something, and another one is to deeply internalize it. I think the struggle is the more human we are, it's so difficult to feel the perception of spirituality in you. Although logically, belief-wise, all that is okay. But in real terms, I feel that we are actually spiritual beings. I like that sentence when he said, the author says, children are spiritual beings having a human experience.
MG, just to tell you that was a statement which was made by Vivekananda almost, 100 years ago.
This is attributed to Khalil Gibran also.
Yeah, various other people have said that. It's there in the scriptures, Buddhas and everything. And but about what you said, I love what Ram Charan is putting there, deconstructed belief, because I don't think that is true. The more human you are, the more spiritual you can be.
Okay.
The definition of what is human. And we can talk about it. We can sit down and talk about it. I think that the trick, as it were, is especially for us coaches, is can we be humanely spiritual or spiritually human or whatever word you want to use. And you can be that so long as you are being authentic and you are being compassionate and you believe in the unconditional positive regard and you are generatively listening. Too many words coming together, but each one takes quite some time to learn. I'm sorry, we are top of the hour at this point in time, but I'm having a ball of a time and I hope you are. And we will continue this exploration and adventure in future conversations on this. There are no limits to it. We can all, like Vishy says that, Selfish Gene, Richard Dawkins. I love that book. There are a lot of things that he says there I completely agree with. There are things which I disagree with as well. So that is the way of life. Thank you very much indeed, and wonderful. Good night to you, good day to you, wherever you are, and good morning to you, Jackie and others, Ram Charan. Bye. Take care. All the best. Bye-bye.